I gave my ex's sister a swim lesson she couldn't touch bottom and wrapped her legs around me. The water was chest deep on me, which meant it was shoulder deep on her, which meant when she panicked and grabbed, she grabbed everything she could reach, both hands on my shoulders, legs around my waist, face about 4 inches from mine, eyes wide, breathing fast, the kind of breathing that has nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with the particular fear that lives below the surface of things, the kind you cannot logic your way out of in the moment it arrives. The pool was otherwise empty. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed their single note. Somewhere deeper in the building a door opened and swung shut, and neither of us moved. I could feel her heartbeat through the contact points where her hands gripped my shoulders. Or maybe that was mine. At that specific moment I was not entirely sure whose was whose. And I was a person who was usually sure about things. This is not how a swim lesson is supposed to go. Let me back up. My name is Ryan Callahan, not Callahan like the family I'm about to tell you about. Different Callahans entirely. Tennessee is full of us, and I am 29 years old and a licensed electrician working out of Chattanooga, which is a city I moved to 6 years ago for a job opportunity and stayed in because the mountains are 40 minutes away and the rent was survivable, and at some point, staying somewhere long enough makes it yours, whether you intended that or not. I live alone in a 2-bedroom apartment on the north side of town. The second bedroom has a workbench in it because I needed somewhere to put the workbench, and a spare room seemed like the right answer. I drive a truck that is 12 years old and runs without complaint, which is the quality I value most in machines and also in people. I have a dog named Walt, who is a brown mutt of genuinely unclear ancestry and very specific opinions about squirrels, and also about where he is allowed to sleep, which is everywhere. A boundary I stopped enforcing about a week after I got him. I cook most of my own food. I sleep well. I am, by most available measures, a person who has gotten the basics figured out. What I have not always figured out is the part where you say what you actually want instead of organizing yourself around what other people want from you. I am better at solving other people's problems than naming my own. I have been this way for as long as I can remember, and I have been aware of it for about 2 years, which is how long it has been since my last relationship ended and I had enough quiet to actually look at the pattern. I used to be a swim instructor. Not as a career. Not seriously. I did it through college at the YMCA on Broad Street because it paid $4 more an hour than the dining hall, and I was a strong swimmer, and someone had to teach the beginner adults who showed up every January convinced that this was finally the year. I did it for 4 years. Quit when I graduated and started the electrician apprenticeship, and have not thought about it much since. The certification lapsed a long time ago. The skills, as it turned out, did not. I was with someone for almost 2 years. Her name was Cassie. She was a marketing manager. She was sharp and direct and funny in a way that cut clean. And she knew what she wanted at all times, with a certainty I found genuinely attractive right up until I realized that what she wanted included me wanting exactly the same things, and I did not. Not all of them. And I was not saying so. I was adjusting. I was accommodating. I was making the shape of what she needed and calling it a relationship. And Cassie was smart enough to feel the difference, even if neither of us named it for a long time. We ended it 8 months ago. No explosion. No betrayal. Just 2 adults in a parking lot after a dinner that had gone slightly wrong in a way neither of us could quite identify. Looking at each other and finally saying the thing. She cried a little. I drove home and sat at my kitchen table for an hour, doing nothing in particular. Then went to bed. We have not spoken since. I thought that chapter was closed. Then I got a text from her sister. I want to be specific about what I remembered of Nora before that text arrived, because it matters to how the rest of this goes. I had met her 3 times during the 2 years with Cassie, 2 family dinners and a birthday party for their mother in the spring. She was 24. Worked at an independent bookstore in the North Shore neighborhood. Had a face that was easy to underestimate until she said something, and then you had to go back and look at it differently. She was quieter than Cassie. Significantly quieter. In the way that sometimes reads as shy, and sometimes reads as something else. Something more considered. She had a habit of starting to say something, and then letting Cassie finish the sentence. Not because she didn't know what she was going to say, but because it was easier to let someone else land it. She laughed at her sister's jokes with the specific laugh of someone who has learned the correct amount to laugh, genuine enough to be real, calibrated enough not to take up too much room. I remembered one moment with particular clarity. Second family dinner. Maybe 8 months into Cassie and me. Nora had been in the middle of telling a story about a hiking trail she'd done, a ridgeline she'd reached at sunrise. And there had been something in her voice when she described it, an aliveness, a quality of this actually matters to me that she didn't often let show. She'd gotten about 3 sentences in when Cassie had said, affectionately, to the table, she's obsessed with hiking. I cannot understand it. She's terrified of the water, but she'll go up a mountain in the dark, and the table had laughed. All of them. Warmly. And Nora had smiled and said, yeah. I know. And the story about the sunrise on the ridgeline never got finished. I thought about that for a day or two after, and then I stopped thinking about it because it wasn't my business, and I was good at deciding things weren't my business. The text came on a Wednesday evening in September. I was eating dinner at the kitchen table. Walt stationed underneath, hoping for the statistical possibility of something falling. And my phone buzzed with a number I did not have saved. Hi, Ryan. This is Nora, Cassie's sister. I'm really sorry to bother you with this, and I completely understand if it's weird. I was wondering if I could ask you something. I read it, set the phone down, picked it up. Of course, I wrote back. What's going on? What followed was a text that had clearly been drafted and revised multiple times. I could feel the editing in it. The places where something more had been smoothed down into something less. She was going on a trip in 6 weeks. Outer Banks. A week with a group of friends. Kayaking and swimming, and the general coastal experience. She had said yes to the trip before fully processing that the swimming would be a real and unavoidable component of it. She was 24 years old and did not know how to swim, and was going to spend a week on a beach with people who did not know that about her. And she had 6 weeks to fix it. And she had remembered that I used to teach at the YMCA, and she knew this was a strange thing to ask. And she understood completely if it was too uncomfortable given the situation with Cassie. And she was sorry for the long message. She had apologized twice in a text asking for help. I counted. I sat with it for 15 minutes. I ran the practical math first 6 weeks. 2 sessions a week. Beginner adult. Doable. Then I sat with the less practical math, Cassie's sister. Someone I had met 3 times. Someone who had apologized before asking. I thought about the hiking trail story that never got finished. I wrote back Saturday morning. 9 o'clock. YMCA, on Broad. I'll be there. Bring a suit, and don't eat a big breakfast before. 3 dots appeared immediately. Then thank you so much. I'll pay you. Obviously. Don't worry about it. I wrote, see you Saturday. She was there at 8:53. I know because I was already in the natatorium when she came through the door, doing a lane check, and I looked up and saw her come in and stop just inside the entrance. Looking at the pool with the specific expression of someone who has made an agreement their nervous system has not yet ratified. She was in a black one-piece suit with her hair pulled into a tight clip at the back of her head. She was carrying a towel with both hands, gripping it. And she was looking at the water the way I'd seen the January beginners look at it, not with hatred, not with active fear, just with the careful attention of someone sizing up an opponent. I climbed out of the lane I'd been checking and walked over. Hey, I said. Hey. She looked at me, then at the pool, then back at me. It's bigger than I thought it would be. It looked smaller on the website. It looked manageable on the website, she said. Pools do that, I said. They look manageable until you're standing next to them. Is that reassuring? Probably not. Come on. We started at the steps. This is always where you start with adults who are afraid of water, not afraid of drowning specifically, just afraid of the quantity of it, the way it moves and accepts and doesn't negotiate. You start at the steps because the steps have a visible bottom, and knowing there's a bottom to stand on is about 70% of the psychological work of learning to swim. Nora went into her knees and stopped. This is fine, she said, in the specific voice of someone for whom things are not entirely fine. Go a little deeper, I said. She went to her waist. Her arms came up and out instinctively. hovering over the surface like the water might rise to meet them. Arms down, I said. I know. They're still up. She looked at her arms like they had made an independent decision and consciously lowered them. I'm aware that this is slightly embarrassing, she said. It's not embarrassing, I said. Adults who didn't learn young have to unlearn the fear response before the mechanics will work. The fear is the first lesson, not a detour around it. She considered that. That sounds like something from a manual. I was an electrician before I was a swim instructor, I said. Manuals are how I understand things. She almost smiled. Not quite. Not yet. But the preliminary motion of one. Manuals are how you understand things, she repeated, like she was logging it somewhere. Okay. So what does the manual say next? We spent the first session in water that reached her collarbone at the deepest point we went. By the end of it, she could float on her back for 8 seconds. I know 8 seconds sounds like nothing. It is not nothing. Floating on your back requires a specific act of trust. You have to let the water hold you, which means you have to believe, in the part of your brain that is not the reasoning part, that it will. For people who have spent their whole lives treating water as something to be wary of, 8 seconds of believing otherwise is a significant distance to travel. She stood on the pool deck when we finished, wringing out her braid, looking at the water. That was genuinely terrifying. You did well, I said. I floated for 8 seconds. Yesterday you couldn't have floated for one. I said, 8 seconds from zero is not a small thing. She looked at the pool for another moment. Then same time Thursday. Same time Thursday. The second session was harder, which is usually how it goes. Fear is patient. It rebuilds itself in the gaps between experiences. So 48 hours was enough time for it to refortify. And she came in on Thursday tighter than she'd left on Saturday. More defended, having to re-earn the ground she'd already covered. I adjusted. Less instruction. More time, simply being in the water. Moving around in it. Letting the environment become something familiar and survivable before asking anything of it. Sometimes the best thing you can do is stay in the difficult place long enough that it stops feeling like a crisis. During a quiet stretch near the end of that session, while she was standing chest deep, and we weren't doing anything in particular, she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "When I texted you," she said, "you wrote back fast." "I deliberated for 15 minutes," I said. "But you said yes. You needed help with something specific." I said, "I had the skill to help." The math was pretty simple. She was quiet for a moment, chin hovering just above the waterline. "Cassie doesn't know I texted you," she said. I assumed. Does that bother you?" "Nora," I said, "you needed swim lessons. I used to teach swim lessons. We're both adults. It doesn't need to be more complicated than that." She looked at me with the expression of someone checking whether what they'd just heard was true, running it against some internal calibration. Then she nodded and pushed off the wall to practice her kick, and I walked alongside and didn't say anything else. And somewhere in that stretch of quiet I noticed that I was paying attention to things that had nothing to do with swim mechanics, the way she counted her strokes under her breath, the specific shape of her focus when she was working through something difficult, the way her shoulders were different in the water than out of it, less load-bearing. I noticed that I was noticing. By the third session, the lessons had become something I thought about between them, not obsessively, not with any plan attached, just present in the background, the way things are present when they've started to matter without your explicit permission. I noticed what she wore to the pool. I noticed she brought the same water bottle every session and took exactly 2 sips between drills. I noticed she was considerably funnier than she'd appeared at the family dinners, a dry, quiet humor that surfaced in the spaces between more serious things and didn't announce itself, just appeared and let you catch it or not. She had the habit, which I'd noticed at the dinners too, of beginning a sentence and then delivering a shorter version of it. Over the course of those first few sessions, I started to hear the shape of what the longer version would have been, and I started, without thinking about it, to leave space for it. Just a beat of quiet after she spoke, not pressing, not filling. Sometimes she'd take it, sometimes she wouldn't, but I stopped filling the gap with something of my own. On the Thursday of the third week, she was doing kick drills in the shallow lane, and I was walking alongside, and she came up for air and said, unprompted, "Can I tell you something without it being a thing?" "Depends on what the thing is," I said. "Fair enough." She stopped at the wall, pushed her goggles up onto her forehead, turned to face me. "I've been sleeping better since we started. I don't know if it's the swimming specifically or just having something concrete to work toward, but I've been sleeping better and I wake up earlier and I feel I don't know, less stuck." I could tell that was not the full version of what she'd started to say. The full version was longer and said something more specific about her life. And she'd delivered the compressed edition instead, but I didn't reach for the rest of it. "Swimming does that," I said. "Your brain can't maintain background noise when it's processing water. The physical environment is demanding enough that the other channels go quiet." "Is that from the manual?" "Different manual. Same principle." She laughed, a real one. Unmanaged, taking up the space it needed, without checking first whether that was okay. It lasted a second, and then she looked briefly surprised by the size of it, like it had traveled farther than she'd planned. "What?" "Nothing," she said. "You're just easier than I expected." She pushed off the wall before I could respond, and I let her go. And I stood in the shallow end thinking about the word easier and what she'd meant by expected. The 5th session was a Saturday in mid-October. 4 sessions in. The fear had begun to lose its structural hold. It was still there. I could see it in the way she checked for the bottom before committing to anything. But it was no longer running the whole show. We were working on what I think of as the commitment problem, which is the moment when you have to let go of the thing you're holding and trust the medium to take your weight. In swimming, this is literal. In most other things, it is also literal, but people prefer to think of it as metaphorical. I'd had her do a series of push-offs from the wall, hands on the tile, feet planted, then push and glide and let the water receive you. She'd done it twice cleanly. Third time, she pushed at a slightly different angle and came up facing the wrong direction. And for 1/2 second, she couldn't find the wall and couldn't find the bottom. And that 1/2 second was enough. She grabbed me. I was right there. I was always positioned right there during these drills, close enough to be useful. And she grabbed my shoulders and her legs came up around my waist, because that is what a body does in water. When it is frightened and there is something solid nearby, it holds on. I planted my feet. I held still. The water at that spot came to just below my chest, which meant she was entirely above the bottom, which meant she was completely fine, which meant this was not an emergency by any physical measure. "Hey," I said. "Quiet. Level. You're okay. I've got you." "We're standing." Her face was tucked against the side of my neck. Her breathing was too fast, the shallow, rapid kind that fear produces. But even as I paid attention to it, I could feel it begin to even out. "I've got you," I said again. "Nothing's happening. The bottom's right here." She breathed. One deliberate breath. Then another. The grip on my shoulders changed from clutching to something more like holding. The water was very still around us. The overhead lights kept humming. The building kept being quiet. After maybe 30 seconds, she lifted her head. She was about 4 inches from my face, and her eyes were still wide, but the fear was draining out of them. And what was coming in underneath it was something neither of us had a word for yet. Or at least, neither of us was saying one. "Sorry," she said. Immediate. Reflexive. "Don't be," I said. I panicked. "I know. You're allowed to." "I wasn't supposed to." "Nora," I said. "You pushed off a wall in deep water and lost your orientation for 1/2 a second. That's not a failure. That's swimming." She was quiet for a moment, still close. Still, with her hands light on my shoulders. Now, instead of gripping, I was aware of a significant number of things simultaneously, and I was not examining any of them directly. "Again," she said. I looked at her. "You want to?" "I don't want to end the session on a grab," she said. Her voice was steady now, the fear breathing gone. "I know myself. If I end on a grab, the grab is what I'll remember, and it'll be twice as hard on Thursday." She looked at the open water ahead of her. "I want to do it again." I stepped back to give her room. She turned to the wall. She placed both hands on the tile, both feet on the surface below it, and she looked at the water ahead of her for about 3 full seconds. Then she pushed off. She came up on the correct side this time. Found the surface without scrambling for it. Found me with her eyes. And she was fine. She stood up. She pushed the water out of her face with both hands. She didn't grab anything. "There," she said, quietly, mostly to herself. "There," I agreed. She climbed out at the end of the hour, and on the pool deck she reached up and took the clip from her hair and shook it loose. And she gathered it over one shoulder while she looked at her phone. And I was in the pool still, doing absolutely nothing useful, just standing in chest-deep water watching the way the light came off the surface. Thinking about the very specific shape of trouble you can find yourself in when you weren't looking for any trouble at all. I didn't name what it was yet. I wasn't ready to name it, but I knew what it felt like, which was like a circuit that had been open for a long time and had just found its other end. 2 weeks later, I got a text from Nora on a Wednesday evening. Her parents were having a dinner on Saturday. Small thing, her mom, her dad, Cassie, a couple of family friends. Her mom had heard about the swimming lessons and wanted to say thank you in the way her mom did things, which meant food. A lot of it. Presented as though feeding you was a personal calling. Nora said she'd understand completely if I didn't want to come, given the Cassie situation. She said she didn't want to make anything weird. I sat with it for about 10 minutes. Then I wrote back, "I'll be there. What time?" I should have thought more carefully about the geometry of it. Specifically, I should have confirmed with Nora that Cassie knew I was coming, rather than assuming Nora had handled that. I had not considered the possibility that Nora had told her parents, and not her sister, and that Cassie would open the front door of her parents' house and find me standing on the front step with a bottle of wine. The sound Cassie made when she opened the door was very small. A single breath. Quickly recovered. She looked at me with an expression that went through 3 things in about 1 second and landed on composed. "Ryan," she said. "Hey, Cassie." I held up the wine. "Your mom invited me." She stepped back and let me in, and I walked into the warmth of her parents' house. And the evening began. The Callahan home was the kind of house that has been lived in long enough to have settled into itself photographs on every available surface. A kitchen that smelled like something had been cooking since mid-afternoon. Furniture that prioritized comfort over appearance. Patricia, their mom, came out of the kitchen immediately and took the wine and said something about how she'd heard so much and I didn't need to bring anything. And Jim, their dad, appeared from the direction of the living room and shook my hand with the grip of a man who has worked with his hands his whole life and respects the same in other people. Nora was in the kitchen helping her mom. And when she came out and saw me, her face did something quick and warm that she then arranged into something more neutral. And I noted both things. We sat down to eat. Cassie was at one end of the table. I was across from Nora toward the middle. And the dinner was good in the surface sense. The food was excellent. Jim asked detailed questions about electrical work that were genuinely curious rather than polite. Patricia kept adding things to everyone's plates with the confidence of someone who has never once been told to stop. We talked about the bookstore where Nora worked, about a renovation Jim had been thinking about for the garage, about the trip Nora was preparing for. It was about 40 minutes in the gap between the main course and Patricia going to get the dessert, that Cassie said lightly, conversationally, to no one in particular, "So, how long has this been going on?" The table shifted, not visibly, but something changed in the air. "The lessons," Nora said, "about 5 weeks. And you didn't mention it." Cassie said, "Still light, still surface-friendly. It didn't really come up." Nora said, "It didn't come up." Cassie tilted her head slightly. "That you've been spending time with my ex. He's been teaching me to swim." "Cass, we meet at the Y for an hour." "I'm just noting," Cassie said, "that it didn't come up." "Cassie," Jim said it with the particular parental tone that doesn't raise its voice and doesn't need to. "I'm just having a conversation," Cassie said, pleasantly. I set my fork down. I looked at Cassie directly. "Your mom wanted to say thank you," I said, even and without edge. Nora needed to learn to swim before a trip, and I have the skill to help her do that. That's the whole thing. Cassie held my gaze for a moment. Something moved behind her eyes, not anger. Something more complicated and less resolved. Then she nodded. "Of course," she said, and she picked up her fork. and the dinner moved on. Patricia came back with dessert, which was 2 kinds of pie because one kind was never the answer in this house, and the surface of the evening smoothed over and held. Jim told a story about attempting to fix the kitchen faucet himself 2 years ago that was specific in its details and self-aware in exactly the right measure, and everyone laughed. And Cassie was charming and funny and gave every appearance of being completely fine. But I noticed, underneath all of it, that Nora had gone quieter than she'd been in the pool. She was answering questions directed at her and laughing at the right moments and passing things across the table with the fluid efficiency of someone who has done this for years, and she was doing it all with about a third less of herself than she'd brought to Thursday's swim session. And I understood, in a way I hadn't fully understood before, what performing aversion meant, not as a concept she'd described, but as something I was watching in real time. After the dishes were being cleared and Jim had taken me to the back porch to look at the garage situation, he'd been thinking about junction box placement. He wanted to know if what he was imagining was feasible. Cassie appeared. She waited until Jim had gone back inside to confer with Patricia, and then she was just there, leaning against the porch railing, and the dinner table lightness was entirely gone. "Can we talk for a second?" she said. "Sure," I said. She looked out at the backyard, which was fully dark by then, just the shapes of trees against a slightly lighter sky. She was quiet for a moment in a way that told me she was choosing between several versions of what she wanted to say. "I'm not trying to be difficult," she said. "I know," I said. "I don't want you back," she said. Clear. Direct. No hesitation. "I want to be straight about that. I think we ended for the right reasons." "I think so too," I said. "But there's something." She stopped, shook her head slightly. "I can't fully explain it. Something is happening and I didn't know to have a feeling about it, and now I have one and I don't know what to do with it." I thought about Nora in the kitchen, moving efficiently through a space she'd grown up in, being 3/4 of herself without seeming to notice she was doing it. I thought about the hiking trail story. I thought about the things that were Nora's to tell and not mine to translate. "What do you actually want out of this conversation?" I said. She looked at me. The question seemed to land somewhere she hadn't fully prepared for. She was quiet for a few seconds, which for Cassie, who was never at a loss, was its own kind of answer. "I don't know," she said finally. "I think that might be the real answer," I said, not unkind, just accurate. She was quiet another moment. "Then don't hurt her," she said. It came out different from everything else she'd said, less managed, closer to the surface. "I'm teaching her to swim," I said. Cassie looked at me with an expression that made it clear she understood that wasn't what either of us meant, and that I understood she understood, and that we were both going to leave it there. She went back inside. I stood on the porch, breathing the October air for a few minutes, and then the back door opened and Nora came out carrying 2 cups of coffee, which she handed me without asking whether I wanted one, and we stood at the railing side by side looking at the dark yard. "I heard some of that," she said, stating it, not apologizing for it. "How much?" "Don't hurt her," she said. "And what you said back?" I looked at my coffee cup. "I'm sorry," Nora said, and then immediately made a small, frustrated sound. She stopped. "I keep doing that. Apologizing for things that aren't my fault, or that aren't even bad things that need apologizing for." "Why do you do it?" I said. She was quiet for a long moment. Below us the yard was just dark shapes. From inside came the muffled sound of her parents in the kitchen, the familiar low-frequency warmth of a house that has held the same people for a long time. "Because it's easier," she said finally. "Apologizing first means you don't have to wait to see if the other person is upset. You preempt it. You make yourself small before anyone has to tell you to." She said it like something she'd identified a long time ago and had not previously said out loud. "How long have you been doing that?" I said. She considered. "Probably as long as I've been in the same room as Cassie," she said. And then, quickly, I'm not saying she makes me. She doesn't make me. It's something I developed. A habit." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "Cassie is very good at taking up exactly the right amount of space. She always has been. And I've spent 24 years figuring out how to fit around whatever space was left. And I got so good at it that I forgot it wasn't the only option. What's the other option? I said. She looked at me sideways. A brief look. Checking something. Taking up space. She said. Deciding what you want and wanting it without first checking whether wanting it will inconvenience someone else. She paused. Finishing the story about the ridgeline even if Cassie makes a joke about it. I went still. She noticed. What? You remember that? The hiking story at dinner. Of course I remember it. She said. I was the one telling it. She looked at me more directly. You remember it. I remembered it after. I thought about it, the way it got cut off. She was quiet for a moment, and something in her expression shifted, not the composed version that managed itself, but something underneath. Something that hadn't been shown at the dinner table. What happened at the end of the trail? I said. The ridgeline, the sunrise. She looked at me for a second like she was checking whether the question was real. The fog had come in below the ridge overnight, she said, slowly. So when I got to the top, I was above it. I couldn't see the valley, just the fog, and then other peaks coming through it, and the sun coming up behind them. It looked like she paused. It looked like the world had just started, like I'd gotten there first. She said it quietly, not performing it, not packaging it for a table of people, just saying what it was. That's a good end to the story. Yeah, she said. It is. We stood there for a while after that, not saying much. The October air was cool and specific in the way October air in Tennessee is, and somewhere, a neighbor's dog was making its feelings known about something, and the kitchen sounds from inside were warm and continuous. You're different than I thought you'd be, she said eventually. How'd you think I'd be? She considered it. Cassie described you as steady, she said. She meant it as a good thing, but I think she also meant it as contained. Like you were reliable but not particularly open. That was accurate for a while, I said. What changed? I stopped being in a relationship where it was more comfortable to stay closed. I said. Turns out the habit only works when there's a context that rewards it. She looked at me with the same checking expression, the one that ran things against an internal meter. Whatever the meter said. She seemed to accept it. I'm glad you said yes to the 9 o'clock Saturday, she said. Quiet. Not looking at me. I'm glad you sent the text, even the second apology and all. She laughed, the real one. You're not going to let me forget the apologies. I think they're important data. Data, she repeated, like she was deciding whether to be offended. Okay. What does the data tell you? I looked at her profile in the porch light, the loose way she was standing now, the cup in both hands, the hair that had lost some of the tight precision it had in the pool. The way she just told me about the ridgeline without packaging it first. That you're working on something, I said. Same thing I'm working on. Different shape. Same project. She turned to look at me fully. Her expression was doing something I'd seen once before in the pool. After the third push-off from the wall, when she'd come up fine and said there to herself. A kind of quiet inventory. What's your version of it? The project. I thought about how to say it accurately. Saying the thing when the thing needs saying, I said. Not waiting for the right moment, because the right moment is usually just the moment you're in. Not adjusting myself into the shape of what's comfortable for the other person, and then being surprised when I don't recognize the result. She nodded slowly. Jess, she said. The name of my ex she'd have heard through Cassie. Yeah, I said. She told me I was like a book someone had glued shut. I've thought about that sentence roughly once a week for 2 years. That's a good sentence. It was accurate, I said. I'm working on the ungluing. Is it going? I looked at her. I thought about the 15 minutes I'd sat with her text before writing back. About the 9 o'clock on a Saturday without overthinking it. About standing on this porch right now saying things I was actually thinking. Better than it was, I said, getting there. Something happened in her face, small. Not dramatic. Just a kind of settling. Like something had been held slightly off balance and had found a level. We went back inside a few minutes later. The evening wound down the way good family evenings do. Dessert got pressed on everyone twice. Jim found a way to make the garage junction box question funny in retrospect. Patricia sent me home with a container of something that turned out to be the best thing I'd eaten in a month. Cassie was perfectly pleasant for the rest of the night. I don't say that with sarcasm. She was genuinely pleasant. Which took something. and I respected it. I drove home with Walt in the passenger seat and thought about ridgelines and fog and getting somewhere first. 4 days later, Cassie called. I was in a residential attic running wire, and I let it go. She called again that evening. I was sitting in my kitchen and I picked up. "Hey," she said. "Hey, I've been thinking about Saturday," she said, "about what I said on the porch." I waited. "I was unfair," she said. "Not to you, you don't need me to be fair to you." We ended. "That's not the dynamic anymore." To Nora. She paused. "I do this thing. I do it without noticing I'm doing it. I make things about me that aren't about me." "Okay. She can take swim lessons from whoever she wants," Cassie said. "She can do whatever she wants. And the fact that she's been doing something that intersects with my life and didn't tell me about it is that's information about our dynamic, not about her judgment. That's a pretty clear-eyed read." "I'm trying," she said. A pause. "Is something happening between you and her?" I thought about the porch, about the ridgeline story, about two people working on the same project in different shapes. "I don't know yet," which was the honest answer in that moment. A long pause. "Okay," she said. "I'm going to call Nora." "I think that's the right thing," I said. "I'm not calling to make it into a thing," she said. "I just think we have some things to say to each other that we've been not saying." "Yeah," I said. "I think you probably do." We said goodbye. I set the phone down on the table and Walt put his head on my knee and I sat there for a while not doing much. I didn't know Nora was outside until I opened the door. She was standing in the hallway of my building, jacket on, hands in pockets, hair down. She had driven across town without texting first, which was something she had told me. At the pool. That she did not do. She was a planner. She confirmed. She texted first. She made sure things were okay before she arrived at them. She hadn't this time. "She called you," Nora said. Statement, not question. "A little while ago," I said. "Come in." She came in but didn't sit. She stood in the middle of my living room with her jacket still on and looked at me directly. "I was in the parking lot when I got here," she said. "Your kitchen window was cracked. I wasn't trying to listen. I just pulled up and you were on the phone and I waited. And the last thing I heard before you hung up was, 'I don't know yet.' That's what I said. I don't want to be an 'I don't know yet,'" she said. Clean and direct. No apology attached. I looked at her, at the person who had sent a text with 2 apologies before the question, who had done it anyway, who had pushed off a wall a 3rd time because she didn't want to end on a grab. I said I don't know yet because I didn't know if it was mine to name before you named it. I said, I wasn't not knowing. I've known since the pool, probably before the pool, if I'm being straight about it. She was very still. "I've been working on saying the thing," I said. "Here's the thing. I didn't want to put it on you before you were ready to have it put on you. And I overcorrected. So, that's the thing." The stillness held for another second. Then something in her released, not dramatically, not in a way you could film, just the way a room changes when a window opens. "I came here without texting," she said. "I noticed. I don't do that. I know. I decided I was done waiting to check whether things were okay before I did them," she said. She sounded almost surprised by herself, in the way you're surprised when you do something new, and it works. "I just came." I thought about 8 seconds, about the 3rd push-off, about there. "I'm glad you came," I said. She let out a long breath. Walt appeared from wherever he'd been sleeping and walked over and leaned against her leg, which is something he does with people he has decided are acceptable. And she looked down at him and then back at me, with an expression that was the most unguarded thing I'd seen from her outside of the pool. We talked for a long time. She told me more about growing up alongside Cassie, not bitterly, not with the quality of a wound being nursed, but with the specific accuracy of someone who has finally gotten enough distance from a landscape to describe its actual features, the way she'd learned to want things quietly, to frame her own desires as not really wanting them, so the loss of them didn't register as loss. The hiking trail, the ridgeline, the number of times she'd let a sentence get finished by someone else because finishing it herself would take up room. I told her about the glued book, about 2 years of sitting with that sentence, about the specific failure mode of adjusting yourself so thoroughly to someone else's preferences that you stop being able to distinguish their preferences from your own. She said, we've been doing the same thing in opposite directions. Yeah. Yours was making yourself smaller. Mine was making myself absent. Both end up in the same place. Which is someone else's version of you, I said, instead of yours. She thought about that. Walt had migrated to being fully across her feet, which was his way of indicating that a person had been approved. She looked down at him, then back at me. What are we doing? She said, not anxious, just asking. I think we're doing this, I said, whatever this is, and figuring out the rest as we go. She nodded, slowly, like she was checking it against the internal meter. Whatever the meter said, it seemed to come back okay. She left around midnight. I stood in my apartment after she'd gone and looked at Walt, who was looking at me with the expression of a dog who has processed the entire evening and found it satisfactory. Yeah, I said, I know. Cassie and Nora had their conversation 2 days later. Nora told me about it in pieces, over the course of the following week. In the way you tell someone things when you're still working out what they meant. It was not a clean conversation. Cassie said things she'd been holding about always being the reference point, always being the one things got measured against. About how she hadn't realized until someone said it out loud that being the standard someone else was compared to was its own kind of trap. Nora said things she'd been holding about finishing her own sentences, about wanting things without apologizing for the wanting. It was hard, and it was incomplete, and neither of them felt great immediately after. Then Cassie texted the next morning, I think I've been making your life smaller without knowing it. Nora sat with that for an hour, and then called her back. And that conversation was better. And the one after that was better still. It's not going to be clean between them permanently. Families aren't clean. But something shifted in the structure of it. And the structure is what matters. The rest is just maintenance. The Outer Banks trip was the second week of November. I drove her to the airport on a Thursday morning. Her bag was in the bed of my truck. Walt was in the passenger seat, looking profoundly put out at being relocated. And she was in the back, looking out the window at Chattanooga, going past in the early light. At the departures curb, I put her bag on the sidewalk and she hugged me. Both arms. And held it for a few seconds longer than a leaving hug needs to be. And I held it back the same way. She pulled back and looked at me. She had the clip in her hand. Hadn't put it in yet. Her hair loose in the November morning. Text me when you land, I said, obviously. And when you get in the water, she looked at me. You think I'm going to do it? I know you're going to do it. I said, you did it in a pool with fluorescent lights and a lane rope. The ocean is just bigger. That is not reassuring. I know, I said. Go. She smiled full. Real. The one that took up the space, and she shouldered her bag and walked through the automatic doors, and I drove home with Walt sulking in the passenger seat, and the quiet that comes from having time. Something good in your life that you didn't plan for and are therefore slightly afraid of losing, which is just the tax you pay on caring about things. The video arrived Saturday afternoon. No caption, no text before or after, just a video. 23 seconds. She was in the ocean, not at the edge, not in the breaking waves. She was out past where the waves formed, in the part where the water has no bottom that matters, where you are committed to it. The camera was shooting from the shore, handheld, at the angle of someone who has waded into their knees to get the shot. And Nora was swimming not the perfect pool mechanics we'd built over 6 weeks, but something more real than that. Something that had taken the mechanics and made them hers. Her arms pulling the water behind her, her head turning for air on the right side, moving through the Atlantic Ocean like someone who had decided the Atlantic Ocean was not going to be the thing that stopped her. Her hair was loose in the water behind her. She hadn't put the clip in. I watched it 3 times. Then I opened a browser tab and searched for flights to the Outer Banks. The cheapest one left Friday at 6 in the morning and landed mid-morning. It had a connection in Charlotte that was tight but doable. I looked at it for about 30 seconds, which is considerably less time than I would have spent on a decision like this a year ago. And I booked it. I texted her, question. She wrote back, okay. I wrote, what beach specifically? A pause. Longer than usual. I set the phone down and went to get Walt's leash, because he'd been looking at me with the particular intent that means he requires a walk. When I came back, there was a reply. 4 words. Avon. Saturday. Bring Walt. I looked at my dog, who was sitting by the door with his leash in his mouth, looking at me with an expression that said he had been patient, and the patience had a limit. Change of plans, I told him. We're going to the beach. He dropped the leash and looked at me for a moment, recalibrating. Then he picked the leash back up and wagged his entire back half, because Walt has always been better than me at deciding something sounds good and going with it. I packed that night. Lighter bag. Walt's things. The basics. I set an alarm for 4:30 and went to bed earlier than I usually did and lay there for a while looking at the ceiling, thinking about the sequence of things that had gotten me here. A text with 2 apologies. A 9 o'clock Saturday. 8 seconds, floating. A push-off from a wall. Ag grab. Another push-off. A porch in October. A ridgeline with fog below it and the sun coming up behind the other peaks. A video of someone swimming in the ocean with their hair loose. Some things you can't learn by standing in the shallow end. You can understand them there. You can practice the mechanics. You can build up to it. But at some point the lesson requires open water. At some point you have to push off from the wall and not reach for anything and trust that the medium will take you. I had spent a long time standing in the shallow end of various things, telling myself I was being careful, telling myself I was being reasonable, telling myself that the right moment would arrive if I just waited long enough. The right moment doesn't arrive. The moment you're in is the one you get. The alarm went off at 4:30. I got up. I made coffee. Fast. Drank most of it standing over the sink. I loaded Walt into the truck and drove to the airport in the dark. And the mountains to the east were just shapes against a slightly lighter sky. And somewhere behind them the sun was already working its way up. And I thought, this is what it feels like to do the thing, instead of waiting to do the thing. I know how this sounds. I know it sounds like a lot to attach to a 23-second video and a flight to the coast. But I think that's how it works. Actually, the big things don't announce themselves as big things. They come as a video with no caption. They come as a text with 2 apologies. They come as a knock at the pool deck door at 8:53 in the morning. Someone standing there looking at the water like it's an opponent and deciding to get in anyway. The flight was on time. Walt was good, which he always is in transit, because travel activates some calm, ancient part of him that daily life doesn't reach. We landed in the mid-morning and I rented a car at the small regional airport, and Walt had his head out the window by the time we were on the highway. And the sky over the Outer Banks was the specific blue that sky is near the ocean, wider than inland sky, like it has more room to be itself. She was on the beach when I got there. I parked and got Walt on his leash and we walked down through the seagrass to the sand, and I could see her from 50 yards away, standing at the water's edge with her feet in the break, her hair moving in the wind off the Atlantic, and she was looking out at the water with the same expression she'd had that first Saturday at the pool, but different now. Different in the specific way that things are different when you've done them, and they turned out to be survivable, and even against expectations. Good. She turned around before I was close enough to say anything, like she'd felt the direction of something shift. She saw me. She saw Walt. She looked between us for a second. Then she said, "You booked a flight." I did. You booked a flight and brought your dog. He wanted to come. Walt, who had been sitting patiently at the end of his leash waiting for the social portion of things to resolve, chose this moment to make his interest known, and she crouched down and let him say hello. And he said it thoroughly, and she laughed, the real laugh into the top of his head, and looked up at me from where she was crouching in the sand. Some things you can't learn by standing in the shallow end. I'd texted her that line 3 weeks ago, the night I booked the flight. She'd read it and sent back a single question mark, and I'd said I'd explain later. That's what I meant. She stood up. She was in a swimsuit and a pullover, barefoot in the sand, her hair doing what hair does in an ocean wind. She looked at me with an expression that was not the composed version, not the managing version. Just her, the person who'd told me about the ridgeline, who'd pushed off the wall a 3rd time, who'd swum out past the breaking waves with her hair loose and let someone film it and sent it without a caption. "Hi," Hi. The Atlantic kept doing what the Atlantic does, indifferent and constant. And Walt sat between us in the sand, looking at the water with tremendous personal interest. And I thought here, this is the there. If you've ever waited so long to do something that you almost missed, the window drop that in the comments. I want to know what finally made you move. And if you've ever made yourself smaller to fit into a space you were given, rather than the space you were actually meant for. Tell me how you started taking up more room. We're all somewhere between the shallow end and the open water. The trick, I think, is to keep swimming. If this one meant something to you, subscribe. There's more coming. And it's all true, more or less, in the ways that matter.